Welcome to Friday Q&A, where I answer all your questions as always. If you have questions for next week, do not hesitate to put them in the comments and I will do my best to answer them all in due course. Let's get straight into this week's question. Scott Chapman asks me, who are some of my favorite Aussie guitar players? I love this question because I think for people in Australia and people around the world, we tend to overlook Australian guitar players so much because there's such a focus, I think, on, I guess, the transatlantic heroes, you know, whether you've got your Claptons and your Jimmy Pages and your Pete Townsends and Jeff Becks, or you've got your, I guess, on the other side, all the great American guitar players, EVH, Randy Rhoads, Hendrix, you know, all these people who just really shape the face of the guitar. But I think most people would probably think about Australian guitar players and probably just think about the Young Brothers, and I love both of them, obviously. They're responsible for some of my favorite albums, like Power Age, for example. And I should, out of the two Young Brothers, obviously Angus and Malcolm that I'm talking about, I love Malcolm's rhythm playing so much. That is just a dark art, and the way that he was able to drive that band is really, really inspiring. So obviously those two guys. If you're an Aussie, no doubt you would have heard loads and loads of the John Farnham stuff on the radio, right? So Phil Buckle, who played on a lot of those records, I think is a super underrated player. And then he played in a band called Southern Sons, who probably contained my favorite Australian guitar player of all time, Irwin Thomas, aka Jack Jones. And if you haven't heard the first Southern Sons album, it's an AOR classic in my opinion. Virgil Donati on drums, Jack Jones absolutely killing it on vocals and guitar. And yeah, Irwin also played in a band called Electric Mary, and they opened for Judas Priest maybe 10 years ago, and I went to see them, and he just dropped this guitar solo in one of the songs, and it still to this day, I think, is the most incredible guitar playing I've ever witnessed live. And this is after, you know, seeing nearly all of my favorite bands and all of my favorite guitar players live. That guitar solo that Irwin Thomas played is just like my favorite thing ever. So that made a huge impression on me as a young player. And the other guy who played a lot with John Farnham and played on a lot of sessions is Brett Garsed, or Brett Garsed, however you want to say it. And his stuff, to me, is just the sound of my childhood. You know, growing up in Perth in the early 90s, and, you know, hearing all the Farnham stuff on the radio and all the other Aussie pop stuff that he played on. And his slide playing is just out of this world, and then he's got these monster fusion legato chops, and everything I've seen with him, he just seems like a pretty down-to-earth kind of guy. So Brett Garsed, Jack Jones, aka Irwin Thomas, definitely two of my favorites from that era. And the Young Brothers, somebody who I really, really love is a guy called Chris Brooks. If you want to learn how to shred, just go and get his stuff. He's out of this world, insane. Yeah, watching him play makes me want to give up. So Chris, if you're watching this, yeah, I hate you. No, not really. I love you. You're an amazing player. But Chris Brooks, if you haven't checked him out already. Mark Furtner, the guitar player from Lord, is another monster as well. These are kind of metal guys. If you're not familiar with a guy called Stu Marshall, he was the guitar player in a band called Dungeon, and then they kind of became Lord, and Stu's played on a bunch of really great records with some of my favorite singers. Just the consummate metal guitar player in my eyes. So a couple of pop guys. Who else? Who else do I really, really like? Obviously, if you're a fan of YouTube and you're a fan of this channel, you'd be familiar with Brett Kingman. He is pedal demos, but he also plays guitar with James Rain, and every time I've had the opportunity to meet Brett, he's just been a lovely, lovely human being as well, and his tones are some of the best in the biz. So his stuff. Who else would I rank as great Australian guitar players? A friend of mine, actually, if you've never heard of a band called Psychonaut and you love thrash metal, go and check them out, because the guitar player Mark DeVatimo is one of my favorite guitar players of all time. I could just listen to that guy play. He is like the sound of adrenaline coming out of the instrument. Who else? Who else do I really, really admire? There's so many players. A lot of local guys in Perth who I think are just like out of this world and play rings around anybody else. I've mentioned some of them before. If you go and check out a guy called Luke Gallagher on YouTube, check his stuff out. He's phenomenal, great young country player. A guy called Chris Gibbs, who's just kind of like, you know, he is guitar in Perth as far as I'm concerned. One of the hardest working dudes out there, and he's got some great instructional stuff on YouTube as well that you can check out. And yeah, man, there's like too many to name. I think a lot of guys doing great stuff in original rock bands at the moment. If you like your sort of hair metal themed stuff, go and check out a band called Atomic Riot. The guitar player in that band, Drew, is phenomenal. Band called, I gotta remember this now, my buddy Jared Marsh. What's the name of his band? Native Tongue. They've got a single out and he's a great player, really kind of Richie Kotzen influenced. I'm just going to tell you about all my mates. And a great band from Sydney called Bad Moon Born. Ned and Voya are really, really amazing players as well. And I'm sure I've missed a bunch of people, so go and check out some of that. There's some great new music coming out. And yeah, you know, Australian players have a way of playing. I think it's something in the water, or maybe it's that there's so much sun and stuff like that that we just tend to absorb all the influences from around the world. And I think there's definitely an Australian guitar kind of sound. Oh, one last guy as well. Go and check out a band called Michael Videlli. One of my favorite blues players ever, and he just happens to be from Perth. And we did some touring with those guys when we were over in Europe, and getting to watch them play every night was a highly educational experience. So yeah, there's some of my favorite Australian players. I'm going to stop now because I could just rattle these off forever. So if you want to buy an AX8 and you want to use it with a guitar cab, the power amp that I use is the Matrix GT800 Effects, and essentially it's a relatively flat power amp. The really attractive thing for me with the Matrix stuff is that it is so light and it comes in a single rack space, so you're not adding like a huge piece of gear just to be able to run a cab. I normally run it into a Mesa 212 that at the moment has a Vintage 30 and a T75, both Celestion speakers in it. And yeah, I mean the Matrix stuff is really great. I've had it basically since I got my Axe FX Ultra. It has not skipped a beat. They make really, really solid stuff, and it kind of looks cool because they have the sort of glowing things that make it sort of look like tubes, which I like, even though it's not. And yeah, it's not too noisy, it's really, really clean. I use it to shoot IRs, which is super cool as well. So get onto the Matrix stuff if you're looking to you know, add a power amp and a cab to your modeling setup, or the Seymour Duncan Power Sage, which I haven't tried, but a lot of other people really, really love. So hopefully that answers your question about what the Matrix does and how I use it. This question is coming from Facebook. Scott Milnes asks me, what's the difference between the Axe 2 and the Axe 3, and do they necessarily sound better? I think what you have to weigh up between the 2 and the 3 is the 3 is like a really, really new product. So it is essentially, I believe the quote was that, you know, the Axe FX 3 is the Axe FX 2 if they could give it a hardware upgrade rather than just a firmware upgrade. So the new modeling architecture and stuff like that uses these big Keystone DSPs. I say big, I should say powerful. So you've got brand new DSPs, and at the moment it feels like they are just scraping the surface in terms of what the 3 can do. So to me, it's like if you really want to future-proof your rig, get a 3, because I would say probably for the next 5 or 6 years, it's going to be getting continuous updates and support and stuff like that. This isn't a quote as well, like I don't work for Fractal, so this would just be my guess, like say 5, 6, maybe realistically out to 10 years are going to be supporting this product. And I'm really curious to see how much stuff they can cram into it. So in terms of like features and ins and outs and stuff like that, it's perfect for what I need, because as I've said earlier, my goal is not only to use it in the studio as my interface, which I'm using at the moment, and you know, to basically be the ultimate guitar tracking device, but for using it live, we can run bass through it as well, which is super handy. And potentially, you know, if I wanted to run an extra guitar and not have to patch it in every time, I can just replicate my rig like that. If you saw my video this week, I think I titled it My Favorite Thing About the Axe FX 3. You can do so much with 4 blocks in it, which I think is really powerful. And the new multi-delay block is out of this world. It's so, so good for ambient stuff. And to my ears, the thing that really, really gives the 3 the edge is it's like the touch responsiveness and the way it feels. There's it's one of those things where going from an AX8 to the 3, I didn't notice it so much, but then going back feels a little bit weird. So I'm still using the AX8 for all the live stuff. It's a phenomenal product, and I would say if you went and got an Axe FX 2, the advantage is that they're cheap. And if you're just using it for guitar and you don't need all the other ins and outs, you're probably not going to run out of CPU. If you're just using like a single amp and cab and, you know, you're using a bunch of effects, it's still better than everything except the 3, in my opinion. And at the moment, the 3 just kind of beats it out on like the feature set, and I think, as I said, there's just a little bit more detail going on. I'm really digging the modeling there. But the reality is that if you went and bought a 2, you would be super duper stoked. Or you bought an AX8 as well. You know, they're phenomenal products. I love the way they sound, and I think we passed the singularity in terms of modeling a while ago with those products. So yeah, if you don't have the cash to get a 3, get a 2. Well, get 2 2s, you know, why not? Or get an AX8 and a 2, have a backup, because it's still an amazing product. I love them. I use my AX8 every week. Still sounds great. And the 3 I also use daily, and it, you know, it's a different beast to me. It's just so satisfying to play, but you can't go wrong with anything. Realistically, just get one of them, you know, get into the Fractal ecosystem, and then, you know, maybe down the line, if you find the 2's not working out for you, you can get a 3. This question is from Mellow Yellow on YouTube. If I could only choose one of my rack preamps, what would I choose? And that's a very, very good question, because I do like all of them. As a summary, I would say that my SLO preamp clone is probably my favorite sounding preamp, especially paired with the new Mesa 250 that I got. It's just like the recto from hell. It's so filthy. It's so good for dirty tones, but that's all it does. Like, it's just a beast for distortion. The 80A MP1 I love for the 80s kind of thing, and it was also the first rack preamp I ever got, so I'm kind of sentimentally attached to that one. The PV Rockmaster is great. Super versatile, you know, it's got a really good clean channel, and the crunch channels have a real kind of 5150 kind of sound to them, and the active EQ is really, really powerful, so that's a pretty versatile one. The Rocktron Piranha is great, as I said in my rack video. You know, it's got parametric mids, which are really powerful, and it's more of like a kind of rock preamp. And then the JMP1, which I gigged for years, using probably just the OD1 channel with the bass shift for rhythm, and the OD2 channel for leads. It's got some really good clean sounds, but it's a little bit, I don't want to say generic sounding, but it doesn't have as much character as the other preamps. So at the moment, if I could only keep one of them, I would probably go with the 80A, but I've got something coming this week, which I'm going to do some videos with next week, which will probably interest a lot of you guys. So I'm hoping that this new thing is the one when it comes to rack preamps. And if you can guess what it is, bonus points. Leave a comment and let me know what you think my next preamp is going to be. What do I think about the Triptych Modern model in the AX8? I think I did some videos with the Carolan amps a while ago with the AX8, and I really, really like the Triptych. I borrowed a Takana from a friend of mine, like the real head, and did some videos with that, and that's a super cool rock amp, but to me the Triptych is like a really, really great cross between like a Mesa and a Marshall with its own character going on. So I really like that amp model. I need to play with it more. I actually need to try it out in the 3 and do some videos with it. So the Carolan stuff is phenomenal in real life as well. Like, if you're gonna buy one of those amps, I would highly recommend it. They're actually worth the money, and they're worth the hype. This is a question that I wanted to get to last week, and I would say I didn't have time, but I just simply forgot. I forgot a bunch of questions last week, and I forgot this one twice, so my apologies. But essentially, this one boils down to, what do I think is the role of the bass guitar in a rock band? And that is a whole thing to unpack, so I'll try to take a few minutes to unpack that. I've been really, really lucky in my short career playing music to play with some really fantastic bass players on a pretty regular basis. And basis, see what I did there? Can't help it. And obviously the guy I've played with the most is Ryan, who's a singer and the bass player in Ragdoll. And for what he does, obviously, he's doing double duty there. So not only is he having to absolutely sing his nuts off and scream every night, he's having to keep the low end together and play bass. And sort of the way we use bass as a band is very, very much inspired by, I would say, a couple of bands, namely King's X, obviously for the sort of bass distortion, but also Queensryche. I love the way Eddie Jackson is essentially a root note player, but the way he and Scott Rockenfield use bass and the kick drum to just play super tight together. So that's a big part of what we go for with Ragdoll. There is a lot of syncopated bass guitar lines where Ryan is playing the root note, but he's playing the same rhythm that the kick drum's playing, which is often pretty complicated over a guitar riff that I'm playing. Rather than just going da 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 and playing the root note, he's kind of using it as this intermediary between the rhythmic aspect of the drums and the harmonic and melodic element of the guitar. So for us as a band, that's kind of how we use that. And you know, the other thing is, it's like there's a lot of riffs in our music, so doubling up bass and guitar riffs often sounds awesome. So, and you know, I think Ryan's so underrated for what he does. Like, we'll get people come up to me at shows and be like, "Oh, dude, I love all the riffs and I love you playing and stuff like that." But no one sort of says to him, like, "Man, I love your bass playing and stuff like that." They always talk about his voice, because he's an amazing singer, and rightfully so, but he's also an amazing bass player, and just like, he does, instead of trying to do too much and fill up all the space in a three-piece, he takes away all the fat. And I think that's really an important thing to think about as a bass player. You know, if you're a bass player, why are you taking advice from a guitar player, firstly? But anyway, you know, that aside, I always think that the bass player should do exactly what is necessary. So it's sort of like, if you're playing something and you want to try to get some cool ideas in there, see how much of it you can take out until you take too much out. And then that's how you know you've got a really, really good bass line, to me. Playing hard rock music anyway. If you're playing other styles of music, obviously, this is a totally different thing. Like, I've been doing some gigs with an R&B band, and you know, the bass player, who happens to be one of the most prominent bass players in the world in when it comes to heavy music, I won't name and shame him, but the way he uses bass, and you know, playing this incredible funky stuff, but then layering effects on top of that and playing melodic lines, and you know, a lot of what that band does are songs that are sample based, so kind of using the bass as a creative instrument to offset against the guitar. A lot of the time I'm playing like one chord with a wah pedal, so I'm not doing a lot. So I think in a sort of funky context, or like a prog context, the bass guitar comes into its own and takes up obviously a different frequency range, but often is used to drive the song. And again, it's how it interplays with the drums rhythmically and how it interplays with the guitar harmonically that matters. And yeah, you know, the first band that I joined that kind of became Ragdoll, my buddy Mike playing in it, we wanted to be Racer X, and he's still to this day probably the only bass player I've ever met who can do all the Billy Sheehan and John Alderetti kind of things. And, you know, me and my buddy Troy would be sitting there doing all these fast 16th note picking things, and he's sitting there with his fingers on a 7-string bass just following us. So the way he plays as well is something I really admire, where he's just so accurate and so precise. And another guy who's really influenced by Eddie Jackson. So, and Geddy Lee, you know, if you listen to all the Rush stuff, the way he'll play a pretty solid bass line while he's singing, and then play around that in the other instrumental sections while Alex Lifeson's like droning chords. So I think it's all about being complementary with a bass player. A lot of the time you're going to be playing with a busy guitar player, so you have to keep it simple. But sometimes if you're playing over like ambient guitar chords and stuff like that, you can be a lot more melodic and a lot more creative. And the bass guitar is just a phenomenal instrument in its own right, and I think it's really overlooked, and it's a real dark art. And yeah. You know, I'm talking a lot about bass guitar because I don't really understand how to do it. I'm a guitar player, but I know what I like from bass players. Tom's back. Anyway, talking about the DD20 again, I had a question about how I use it, given that, you know, for most of the things that I do now, I use the Axe effects. Well, I'll give you an example of why I like that pedal and how I use it. Essentially, I have got an analog board that I've still got together because I do a lot of pedal demos, and sometimes it's just nice to play with knobs. Okay, so this is a bit of a mess, but the signal chain is the micro synth into the POG, into the CE3, which I'm using for pitch vibrato, then the DD20, then the H9, which has a shimmer reverb. What I like with the DD20 is setting it up for quite a few repeats on the twist mode. So you get this. Which is pretty cool. And then basically this is just a noise board, so what I would do is I would start probably with the pitch vibrato, which gives me this. Is there a big difference between the Mesa 250 power section and the power section of, you know, like a normal guitar head? Well, I've got a Rev G rectifier here, so let's have a listen to a clip where I'm gonna run my Axe effects, I'm gonna play a loop into it, I'm gonna run one of the amp models into both of those power amps into the same cabinet with the same microphone, and I'll normalize all the clips, and you tell me, can you hear a difference? To me, the power amp, the standalone power amp just sounds a little bit cleaner and punchier, but I don't know. I shouldn't bias your opinions. Anyway, tell me what you think. Okay, this is a kind of longer question, so excuse me, I'm going to read it out. I'm looking for the high-gain 80s guitar sound. I've really been struggling with gear trying to get a good direct recording tone. I've been using a Line 6 Pod 2 for years, and I want to get away from the solid-state tone. Straight away, the Pod 2 isn't terrible, but if you want a really convincing 80s style sound, it's probably not going to be your ticket. Anyway, moving on. It has no tubes, so the tone can only get so fat, if you know what I mean. Well, I'll stop. I'm going to answer this in questions. So I don't think it's really the lack of tubes in the pod that you're hearing, because a lot of 80s distortion is like, you know, a distortion pedal into a crunchy amp, like a Rat or something like that. So it's not necessarily the lack of tubes to me. It's probably just the touch dynamics and the responsiveness and stuff like that. Anyway, moving on. I just got a 2-notes torpedo captor. Excellent piece of gear. I had to save up for that 2 months. I have one now, and it's off the list of gear to buy. Congratulations, you have more gear. Well done. You know, having lots of gear, it's not a bad thing, trust me. So I plugged it into my H&K Switchblade and could not get a tone that I like. Using the onboard cab sim and several IRs that I have, it all sucked. If you're listening to this, obviously the question is, what IRs are you using? I found out that the Switchblade has a solid-state preamp powered by tubes. The preamp sound doesn't cut it going direct. Live through the H&K sounds great. Okay, so now I need either a tube preamp or another amp altogether. As I said earlier, the budget comes into play. Really like the Marshall tone. I was looking at the J&P one, but it's out of my price range. I don't really want used gear, mainly because if I don't like it, I can't send it back. Yeah, of course, that's one of the main things that places like Guitar Center sell you on. But having said that, I'm a huge advocate of buying used gear because you can actually try it, and if you don't like it, just flip it, and don't go silly buying stuff. You know, it's like if you really want something but you're spending like $500 too much than the market value, you probably shouldn't buy it unless you're 100% sure. Anyway, also looked at a Marshall JMD1 100 watt amp head. The same thing there. I'm not sure if the solid state part of the amp will cut the mustard, so now I'm looking at a Bagheera 1990. What I would hazard a guess at is that you might not like the sound of a guitar amp that's mic'd. You might not be used to that kind of tone. Because if you're comparing it to a live amp in a room, that's a totally different thing, and you're going to dial your amp in differently. What I would recommend, though, on a budget, 100%, is just get one of these. This is the Mua 012. Sounds really, really good. You can run it into IRs, you can run it into like power amp simulation and IRs. If you're just recording at home, you know, you got little knobs to tweak, and these are less than $100, and I think this sounds fantastic. It'll sound way better than your pod, and plus, it's tiny, and you know, they're kind of pretty cool. You'd be able to sell them or return them, like I said. And a large part of that is what guitar are you playing, and also for the 80s thing, so much of that is how you play. So a lot of the time, you know, I've found this personally, it's like, man, I just can't get this sound, and it comes down to practice. So yeah, my recommendation would be get one of these little Mua micro pre's. They make a couple of them. They're under $100. You can't go wrong with that. They've got a built-in cab sim. I wouldn't use the built-in cab sim. I would use some like Ownhammer or York or ML IRs or something like that, or get some of my IRs. Hey, they don't sound too bad, and they're free. Or get a VST, like either Mercurial's Reaxis is really good, Spark is really good, or the Fortin Nameless, I think sounds excellent. And that would be my suggestion. You're not going to spend, you know, this stuff's all around the $100 mark. And you can just go, okay, cool, I've got a decent piece of gear and I'm going to work on the playing and I'm going to work on learning about production techniques that we used in the 80s and, you know, learn how to EQ your signal post in a mix when you're using it and stuff like that. And hopefully that will help you dial in better tones. That would be my suggestion. Just to prove the point, I'm going to run this guy direct into my DAW. I'll use a little bit of power amp simulation from Mercurial's Reaxis and I'll get an 80s sound. The settings I'm going to use are basically the ones I've got here. It's sort of like bass around noon. Hopefully you can see that. And then middle and treble pushed and a bit of gain. And I think it sounds fantastic, and that will be the last thing that I do this week in terms of answering questions, and then we'll have a look at the lick of the week. All right, for the lick of the week, I've been watching a bunch of Sean Tubbs stuff. He's amazing. I love Sean. If you haven't seen his gear demos and his playing, he is like a cross between Brent Mason and Eric Johnson. And I like to put his videos on and steal a bunch of his licks. And this one is kind of like a cleaner idea. So I'm going to be on this Strat on the neck and middle position. And I'll just basically show you how it goes. It's in the key of E, essentially based around an E major chord. It goes like this. Let me show you guys. So you're gonna hit the low E, and then you're gonna have the 7th fret on the 7th fret, the 7th fret on the E and the B ready to go. So you're gonna go. Then you're gonna hammer onto the 9th fret of the B and come back off. Then we're going to go the 9th on the G and slide up to the 11th, and then slide from 11 to 12 and back to 11. So then we're going to pull off from 11 to 9 on the D string, slide from 11 to 9 on the A, and then we're going to hit the 7th, which is an E note on the A string. And then at the end you could throw in something like this. And we are in Flavor Town, baby. I will see you guys next week.